My name is Aryaa Khan. I'm your host for tonight and extend you all a very warm welcome to this fantastic evening, the relaunch of Dr. Shashi Tharoor's book, Nehru, the Invention of India. But before I take you further, I would like to take this opportunity to thank you all, express our gratitude that you all took out your precious time, you came in here and made this so very special for us. Thank you so much. Your presence is really, really cherished. Well, we would especially like to thank Honorable Mrs. Sonia Gandhi, who agreed graciously to come here, attend the function, and re-release Dr. Tharoor's book. Ma'am, thank you so much. It's always such a beautiful feeling to have you here, and we are definitely delighted always to be there in your presence. Thank you so much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, as you all know that today is the 129th birthday of our beloved, of our very first 120? Tomorrow. Yes, we are about to begin the evening. So it is the 129th birthday of our very beloved and the very first Prime Minister of our country. Endearingly, we call him Nehru Chacha. Yes, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. And what an icon of a person. I mean, as much as we speak about him, it is always less. But yes, this is what we are here to celebrate, ladies and gentlemen. And we are thinking of we are commencing this evening with a little excerpt from his one of very iconic speeches. Yes, we are talking about the tryst with destiny. Ladies and gentlemen, as you all know, that this speech is considered to be one of the 10 greatest speeches of the 20th century and a landmark in oration. Captures the essence of the triumphant culmination of the Indian independence struggle against the British Empire in India. It was delivered by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru to the Indian Constituent Assembly on the eve of India's independence at midnight on 14th and 15th August 1947 in the Indian Parliament. Let's sit back and hear.
Tryst we made a tryst with destiny, and now the time comes when we shall redeem our pledge, not wholly or in full measure, but very substantially. At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom. A moment comes, which comes but rarely in history, when we step out from the old to the new, when an age ends, and when the soul of a nation, long suppressed, finds utterance. It is fitting that at this solemn moment we take the pledge of dedication to the service of India and her people, and to the still larger cause of humanity. At the dawn of history, India started on her unending quest, and trackless centuries are filled with her striving and the grandeur of her successes and her failures. Through good and ill fortune alike, she has never lost sight of that quest or forgotten the ideals which gave her strength. We end today a period of ill fortune, and India discovers herself again. The achievement we celebrate today is but a step, an opening of opportunity to the greater triumphs and achievements that await us. Are we brave enough and wise enough to grasp this opportunity and accept the challenge of the future? Freedom and power bring responsibility. That responsibility rests upon this assembly, a sovereign body representing the sovereign people of India. Before the birth of freedom, we have endured all the pains of labor, and our hearts are heavy with the memory of this sorrow. Some of those pains continue even now. Nevertheless, the past is over, and it is the future that beckons to us now. That future is not one of ease or resting, but of incessant striving, so that we might fulfill the pledges we have so often taken, and the one we shall take today. The service of India means the service of the millions who suffer. It means the ending of poverty and ignorance and disease and inequality of opportunity. The ambition of the greatest man of our generation has been to wipe every tear from every eye. that may be beyond us, but so long as there are tears and suffering, so long our work will not be over. And so we have to labor and to work and work hard to give reality to our dreams. Those dreams are for India, but they are also for the world, for all the nations and peoples are too closely knit together today for any one of them to imagine that it can live apart. Peace has been said to be indivisible, so is freedom, so is prosperity now, and so also is disaster in this one world that can no longer be split into isolated fragments. To the people of India, whose representatives we are, we make appeal to join us with faith and confidence in this great adventure. This is no time for petty and destructive criticism, no time for ill will or blaming others. We have to build the noble mansion of free India where all her children may dwell.
Wow, that definitely gets our adrenaline going. Ladies and gentlemen, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. Let's hear a big round of applause here. Thank you so much. In the closing paragraphs of his historical speech, though we have not played those lines over here, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru said, "There is no resting for any one of us till we redeem our pledge in full, till we make all the people of India what destiny intended them to be. We are citizens of a great country on the verge of bold advance, and we have to live up to that high standard. All of us, to whatever religion we may belong, are equally the children of India and equal rights, privileges, and obligations. We cannot encourage communalism or narrow-mindedness, for no nation can be great whose people are narrow in thought or in action. To the nation and the people of the world, we send greetings and pledge ourselves to cooperate with them in furthering peace, freedom, and democracy." Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Shashi Tharoor's book goes a long way in fulfilling this promise and pledge made by that wonderful man, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. And it is my joy and honor to tell you that this book that we are relaunching today, titled Nehru, the Invention of India, is being made into a web series by Mr. Sheetal Talwar, Chairman and Managing Director of the Vistar Group. Yes, we have a 2-minute promo of the web series. Let's sit back and watch that.
Orchestrator of the impossible, visionary and brave heart, giant amongst giants, India's favorite son, Panditji Chacha Nehru, or as Bapu affectionately called him, Jawahar.
As I walked round the site, I thought that these days the biggest temple and mosque and gurdwara is a place where man works for the good of mankind.
Bhakra Nangal, Bhabha Atomic Research Center, AIMS, the IIMs, IITs, DRDO, Nehru's temples of modern India are living symbols of his vision and belief in the talent and potential of India and its people. What has Nehru contributed to India seems to be the favorite question of those who are preoccupied with rewriting history and undermining Panditji's political, social, economic, and diplomatic achievements. Ironically, the very fact that they can question this legacy is Nehru's greatest contribution to India. He has willed to us the legacy of the freedom of thought and expression, the legacy of fair debate, the legacy of secularism, the legacy of political magnanimity, and the legacy of democracy. Pandit Nehru's legacy is ours. What we are today, we owe in great measure to him. This is his story.
Definitely waiting for that story to watch, ladies and gentlemen. At this point of time, I would like to invite our publishers, Penguin Random House, to please come on stage and say a few words. Please put up a huge round of applause as we invite on stage Miss Ranjana Sen Gupta.
Good evening. Mrs. Gandhi, Sri Karan Singh, Dr. Tharoor, distinguished guests. On behalf of Penguin Random House India, I am delighted to welcome you to the launch of the new edition of Nehru, The Invention of India by Shashi Tharoor. Among the many portraits of India's first Prime Minister, this is a remarkable book. It is so because it comprehensively and accessibly unpacks the very essence of the Nehruvian idea. It traces Jawaharlal Nehru's intellectual and political journey as he struggled to encompass the myriad, diverse, shape-shifting and various universes of India, and recognized in them the seeds of a vibrant democracy. This is what makes the book, with a new introduction by the author, as timely, as compelling as it was when we first published it. We at Penguin Random House are extremely proud to relaunch this book. I'm sure the coming discussions will illuminate many aspects of Nehru's legacy and of this unique biography. We are very grateful to Mr. Anand Goel for organizing this event. Thank you all for joining us. Enjoy the evening. Thank you so much, Ms. Ranjana. All right, ladies and gentlemen. And now I guess it's the moment that we all have been waiting for. I'm going to introduce you to the man that actually needs no introduction. But yes, as much as I would love to, and I'm going to do it. Well, the author of 17 books from fiction and non-fiction that have been translated into French, German, Italian, Polish, Romanian, Spanish, Malayalam, and Marathi, the former peacekeeper, refugee worker, human rights activist, minister, and now a member of the Indian Parliament from the Thiruvananthapuram constituency in Kerala. Dr. Shashi Tharoor straddles several worlds of experience. Dr. Tharoor completed a PhD at the age of 22, when most of us are thinking what we really want to do in life, from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and helped found and serve as the first editor of the Fletcher Forum of World Affairs, a journal now in its 43rd year. In 1998, Dr. Tharoor was named the Global Leader of Tomorrow by the World Economic Forum in Davos, and as an internationally known speaker whose thoughtful, wise, and inspiring oratory in multiple languages commands attention in auditorium and respect on social media, the recognition continues to be validated. Awards aside, Dr. Tharoor's primary commitment to the country, well, that has been because he returned to our country after 29 years in the United Nations, whereas under Secretary General, he served as the head of the Department of Public Information and as a close counsel and senior advisor to the then Secretary General, Mr. Kofi Annan. Dr. Shashi Tharoor's work, his desires, and his dedication was summarized in one of his own quotes: "India matters to me and would like to matter to India." On Dr. Tharoor's 60th birthday, his niece, Ravini, she quoted some words for him. "Shashi Mama, you made a tremendous leap of faith in returning to India, but it was not your first leap. From the French you learned in the summer to the Malayalam and Hindi you have honed, from Boston to Geneva to New York to Dubai to Trivandrum. While linguistic leaps, global leaps, leaps of faith, you travel and write, you speak because there is more of the world to know and to which to give. We admire you deeply for this, for the optimism that undergirds all of your movements, and for the obstinacy with which you refuse to capitulate to the cynicism that seems so often to the rest of us like the only reasonable response to a beautiful but ugly world." Well, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, a man of heart, mind, direct, truthful, and wise. He's a father, he's a grandfather, he's uncle, brother, son. Without further ado, let me invite our speaker tonight, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, to the stage. Let's give a huge round of applause, please. And well, they say that behind every man there is a woman that really, who's made him. In literal sense, we have with us Mrs. Lily Tharoor. His mother, we would like to honor her with a bouquet. May I please request Mr. Anand Kamal to do the honors. Thank you so much, man, for giving such a wonderful man to us. He definitely makes the world a better place. Thank you so much. A very good evening and a very warm welcome, ma'am.
All right. And now I'm going to call upon someone very special here on stage. Ladies and gentlemen, she is the chairperson of the Congress Parliamentary Party, a member of the Congress Working Committee, and a member of Parliament from Raebareli. Yes, Mrs. Gandhi. She was born in Italy on December 9th, 1946. After her early education, she attended a foreign language school where she studied English, French, and Russian. She met Mr. Rajiv Gandhi in Cambridge, where she was doing an English language course. They were married in New Delhi in 1968, and now she has a son, Rahul, and a daughter, Priyanka, with two grandchildren. Well, after the assassination of her husband in May 91, she set up the Rajiv Gandhi Foundation, a non governmental organization, and its associated think tank, the Rajiv Gandhi Institute for Contemporary Studies. As chairperson of these, she kept herself occupied in their activities which commemorate her husband's legacy. She also heads a number of other NGOs. Shortly before the general elections in 98, in response to widespread demands from Congress party rank and file, she entered public life. She campaigned vigorously on behalf of the party and became the president of the Indian National Congress Party in April 1998. A post she held for 20 years, making her the longest serving Congress president in the party's history. The Congress Party unanimously elected her as its leader in parliament. By convention, she was therefore expected to be sworn in as Prime Minister. But however, she declined to accept the position and nominated Dr. Manmohan Singh to lead the coalition government, and while she became the chairperson of the ruling coalition, the United Progressive Alliance. In the general election in April and May 2009, she once again led the Congress Party campaign. Her party again won the largest number of constituencies, taking its tally to 206 in a House of 543, its best performance since 91. The United Progressive Alliance once again formed the government with Dr. Manmohan Singh as Prime Minister. In the UPA's two terms, she was, with a brief interruption, chairperson of the National Advisory Council, set up to make periodic recommendations to the government in areas of socio-economic importance. Among the initiatives that resulted in official actions were the NAC's recommendations relating to the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, the Right to Information Act, the National Rural Health Mission, the Midday Meal Scheme, the Jawaharlal Nehru Urban Renewal Mission, and the National Rehabilitation Policy. The National Food Security Act, Prohibition of Employment as Manual Scavengers and their Rehabilitation Act 2013, Street Vendor Act 2014, the Right to Education, the Land Acquisition Bill, the Forest Rights Act, and the Universal Health Coverage. My God, let's have a huge round of applause now. That is phenomenal. Well, Mrs. Gandhi continues to play an active role in the Congress Party and in the formulation of its policies and programs. She herself is particularly interested in issues relating to the environment, empowerment of the disadvantaged, especially women and children. Mrs. Gandhi has authored two books on her husband, Rajiv, and Rajiv's World, and has edited 2 volumes of letters exchanged between Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru and Indira Gandhi between 1922 to 1964, entitled Freedom's Daughter and Two Alone, Two Together. Ladies and gentlemen, together, let's give a huge round of applause to Mrs. Sonia Gandhi. May we please request her to join us here on stage. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to unveil the book right here in front of you. The phenomena is coming out of the closet. Yes, Nehru, the Invention of India. Thank you so much for doing the honors. Let's have a huge, huge come on. We can hear it louder. It's our Nehru Chacha. It's amazing how, along with feeling so patriotic about him, you end up feeling that love for him. At least our generation, we do, definitely. Right. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you. Now, at this point of time, I'm going to request Mrs. Sonia Gandhi to say a few words. Ma'am, please, about the book. Sure, ma'am.
Dr. Karan Singh, Shashi Tharoor, distinguished guests, it is a pleasure to join you all today to mark the reissue of Shashi Tharoor's book on that great son of India, Jawaharlal Nehru. I am glad that it is being republished today, and I hope it will remind new generations of the extraordinary contribution Nehru made. So great and so enduring was his impact on all our lives that it is difficult to imagine that he left us more than half a century ago. As India's first Prime Minister, he consolidated our democracy and entrenched the basic values of our polity, values to which we are still proud to lay claim. What are these values? Shashi Tharoor summarizes them as the four pillars of Nehruvianism: democratic institution building, staunch pan-Indian secularism, socialist economics, and the foreign policy of non-alignment. These values were integral to a vision of Indianness that is fundamentally being challenged today, but which remains at the core of our time-tested beliefs. What do these four pillars mean today? First, democracy. It could not have been taken for granted in 1947 that a country beset by acute poverty and torn apart by partition would become or remain democratic. It was Nehru who instilled a democratic culture in our country by his scrupulous regard for the form as well as the substance of democracy. His respect for Parliament, his regard for the independence of the judiciary, his courtesy to those of different political convictions, his commitment to free election, his faith in a free press, and his deference to institutions over individuals have all left us a precious legacy of freedom. Second, secularism. Nehru strived to prevent partition, but when it occurred, he never accepted the logic that since Pakistan had ostensibly been created for Indian Muslims, what remained was a state for Hindus. He lived up to his lifelong conviction that India belonged to all its people and that the majority community had a special obligation to protect the rights and promote the well-being of India's minorities. In both policy and personal practice, Nehru stood for an idea of India that embraced every religion, caste, ethnicity, and language. Third, socialism. It is fashionable today to decry Nehruvian socialism as a system that tied India to many years of modest growth. This does not take into account the circumstances of the early years of independence when massive infrastructure needed to be built up, and the private sector lacked the ability to invest on a large transformative scale. As Rajiv Gandhi said 3 decades ago, over time, the socialist model as practiced in India developed shortcomings. Nehru himself, as a man with an open and questioning mind, would have allowed his practical thinking to evolve with the times. At the core of his socialism was the conviction that in a land of extreme poverty and inequality, the objective of government policy must be the welfare of the poorest, most deprived, and most marginalized of its people. In his day, the best way to attain this goal was by building up structures of public ownership and state control of national resources. Today, our thinking has evolved as it should, and we can take pride in our role in liberalizing our country's economy and in making possible so many new avenues for dynamic enterprise to succeed in a globalizing world. At the same time, we remain steadfast in our concern for the weakest sections of society. Finally, foreign policy. Nehru was a convinced internationalist. For him, in the Cold War, non-alignment was the only possible response to the bipolar divisions of the era. In its essence, the Nehruvian vision was about safeguarding India's independence and self-respect against potential encroachments on its sovereignty. That still lies at the heart of the Indian National Congress's view of the world. We have remained faithful to Nehru's internationalism. Over the years, Congress governments have taken Nehru's ideals forward. They have widened the scope of our democracy through such innovations as Panchayati Raj, with its reservation for women, and the Right to Information Act, to mention just a few. They have defended secularism in the face of violent threats to our nation's diversity. They have deepened socialism innovatively through the creation of a framework of rights, including the right to work, the right to food, the right to education, and the right to fair compensation for land. All of these measures have strengthened and empowered our people, especially the poorest. We all know, as Shashi Tharoor has just said, that this precious legacy is being undermined daily by those who rule us today. They express disdain and contempt for Nehru, for all that he did to build the India that they are bent upon changing for the worse. Today, we must honor him by fighting with determination to safeguard our democracy against those who are undermining it. Shashi Tharoor is a man of many talents: politician, parliamentarian, much sought after speaker, best-selling author, and so much more. And I wish to congratulate him on the republication of this book, which is a valuable reminder of the heritage we have been fortunate to receive from that great man, Jawaharlal Nehru. Thank you. Jai Hind.
Thank you so much for the pearls of wisdom, ma'am. It's always a delight to hear you. Um, Ladies and gentlemen, that is so true from the times that we actually started off just trying to fetch our basics. Here we are on an amazing flight to growth, probably to become one of the superpowers. Yes. And वो कहते हैं ना कि देखनी है मेरी उड़ान तो आसमां से कहो कि कुछ और ऊंचा हो जाए. Because behind him, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru left visionaries like Dr. Shashi Tharoor. So, ladies and gentlemen, now it is time that I invite him here on stage for his speech. Following to which we will have question and answer session over here. So if you have any questions, please be ready. We will come up with mics to you. Thank you so much. Please put up a huge round of applause for none other than Dr. Shashi Tharoor.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Sonia Gandhi, for that admirable summary of the legacy of Jawaharlal Nehru and for your very kind words to me. Most grateful. I have always, when Penguin decided to republish this book, I knew there was only one person I wanted to re-release it. The 2003 edition was released by the then leader of the opposition in the upper house, Dr. Manmohan Singh. And in 2018, the person who is ideal to do this, Srimati Sonia Gandhi, very graciously consented to do so. Ideal not only because she embodies in many ways her role as the custodian of the legacy of Nehruji and the Nehru family, but also because I have a personal memory. I was working in the UN in those days, and far away, the Indian newspapers would make their way to me. The internet was there, of course, but not everything got on the internet in 2003. But I heard from excited friends in India that shortly before the elections of 2004, Mrs. Gandhi had given her first television interview. It was, I think, Walk the Talk with Shekhar Gupta. And Shekhar asked her, so Mrs. Gandhi, what do you like to do in your spare time? And she said, I like to read. So he said, oh, what are you reading now? And she said, Shashi Tharoor's Nehru, the Invention of India. So the result was prompt fame, attention, and success for this volume. So it owes its success to you, Mrs. Gandhi, from the very start. And I'm delighted that you have given it a boost in its second iteration. Dr. Karan Singh ji, thank you so much for your graciousness in joining us. I was telling Mrs. Gandhi, Dr. Karan Singh was a cabinet minister when I was a college student. So I've regarded him with great respect and affection. But I've also had the pleasure of chairing him as chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee of Parliament, of which he was our longest and most senior member until his retirement from Parliament just a few months ago. I don't think it'd be fair to mention everyone here, but some of my former ministerial colleagues, in particular Parliament colleagues, are here. My friend Pallam Raju, my friend Sanjay Singh, my colleague in the All India Professionals Congress, Amita Singh, many others associated with carrying on the torch of Nehruvianism. And of course, I do want to mention and acknowledge the presence of the man who is making a fine web series out of this book, Sheetal Talwar, whose promo you all have just seen. What can I say to you today about the Nehruvian legacy that Mrs. Gandhi hasn't already said? I think that if you look at the legacy he has left us, and you listen, as you must have done, to those words that he himself spoke at that midnight moment of our independence, I think you get a very clear sense of the vision of the man, what he strived to do in his 17 years as Prime Minister. My book, of course, talks about his early career as well, his role from his birth and student days right through his role in the nationalist movement. But today, if we were to look back on the life, what we really need to look at is what he has left us behind. And I would simply add a few details to what Mrs. Gandhi has already spelled out. I think it's important to stress, because it cannot be stressed enough, how much we owe our democracy to Jawaharlal Nehru. You know, in 1947, our country was ravaged by the flames of partition. 1 million people were killed, 13 million people displaced, billions of rupees of property damaged. There was chaos in the land. And it would have been very easy at that time for the leadership of the country to say, democracy is not an option. we need a firm hand to be able to knit together these 565 princely states, these warring factions, these communities ripped apart by such horrendous communal violence. Nehruji was never even tempted by such a prospect. During his first moment of mass public adulation, which is the election campaign of 1936-37, when we had it wasn't a full-fledged election because not everyone had the vote. The British had various restrictions in terms of property rights, literacy, and so on. And so, in fact, I think barely 1 out of 50 Indians actually had the vote, but still it was a mass electorate. And Nehruji was a star campaigner for the Congress, traveling up and down the length and breadth of the country. And it was noticed that he was soaking up the adulation of the masses. Wherever he went, throngs would come, particularly large numbers of women, it was pointed out. There was this tremendous admiration for this charismatic, youthful, vigorous figure. You may have noticed in the promo, Nehruji running up the steps to the podium for his Independence Day address. He didn't walk up, he ran up. He was full of this boundless energy and enthusiasm. And shortly thereafter, a few months thereafter, there appeared in the Modern Review of Calcutta, which was the preeminent intellectual magazine of the era, an article, anonymous, not attributed to anyone, attacking Nehru, saying this man could be dangerous. He enjoys mass adulation far too much. We want no Caesars. A man like him must be checked. Of course, the article created a bit of a buzz. People were curious as to who would have written this attack on Nehru, what it was all about. And in due course, in the fullness of time, not immediately, it emerged that the author of this anonymous attack on Jawaharlal Nehru was none other than Jawaharlal Nehru himself. And the reason was very clear. He wanted to issue this public warning both to himself and to the people of India. Don't let your head be swayed. The country matters more than the individual. The institutions and structures matter more than the fame, the glory, the transient glamour that election victories will bring you. And he carried this spirit through in his 17 years as Prime Minister. It's fascinating reading, obviously, his own thoughts and his own correspondence and speeches, but also fascinating watching him in action in those grainy black and white newsreel footage. For example, the almost excessive deference that he showed to the president and the vice president of the country, who outranked him in protocol terms. Why would he do that? Very simple. In 1948, Gandhiji died. In December 1950, Sardar Patel died. There was simply no one of comparable stature left in the Indian political firmament. The man was essentially unchallengeable. All the more reason he felt to show that he was no supremo. By showing in public on those newsreel films this kind of very gracious deference to the people who outranked him in protocol terms, but clearly mattered much less than him in political terms, he was again conveying, respect the institution. Respect the institution. That was always the message. And that respect for the institution is what built our democracy. It was not just the respect for the presidency and the vice presidency. It was respect for Parliament. Nehruji attended every single day of Parliament, a very striking contrast to what we have seen from our current Prime Minister, who I gather has probably made more speeches in foreign parliaments and assemblies in the last 4.5 years than in his own, of which he is a member. Nehruji not only attended, he obliged his cabinet to be there, and he obliged senior officials to be there. He gave the opposition an importance out of all proportion to their own intrinsic numbers. They were very, very modest. The first couple of elections were gigantic sweeps for the Congress Party. The opposition was insignificant. It could have been disregarded. He never disregarded it. He made sure that the opposition felt free to criticize him and that he took their criticism seriously and responded as much as part of a process of public education, as much as a part of feeling that you are there, you have won votes and come to this house, I owe you an explanation. It was quite remarkable that he also encouraged his own party members to speak out against him. There are many, many memorable moments of this, nothing more famous perhaps than Feroz Gandhi taking him on issue after issue, and in particular when the then finance minister was embroiled in a certain scandal involving the Life Insurance Corporation, the Mundra scandal, and the opposition by a Congress party backbencher led to the resignation of his own party's finance minister. That was the kind of political culture Nehruji was trying to install. And he took it very well. I mean, many of you know the famous story when, in the lead up to the 62 war, he made that perhaps ill-advised remark talking about Aksai Chin, that not a blade of grass grows there. Whereupon it was a Congress party MP, Mahadev Mishra, who stood up in Parliament. Mahadev Tyagi, who stood up and said, I beg your pardon, that's a more contemporary political figure, who stood up and said, pointing to his bald head, not a hair grows here, are you going to give this to the Chinese too? And Nehruji laughed and took in good spirit and conceded his point. This was the kind of spirit you see, and you see it across the board, issue after issue. You see it very much in the respect for the free press that Mrs. Gandhi mentioned. He was frequently lampooned by cartoonists. And the leading cartoonist of the day, Shankar of Shankar's Weekly, Nehruji famously would call and ask for copies of some of the most savage cartoons about him that he could then hang up in his own house. At one occasion, he met Shankar at a reception and said, in the hearing of others, don't spare me, Shankar. And the other thing about him was that he made it a point to give Shankar successively the Padma Shri, the Padma Bhushan, and the Padma Vibhushan. And this was a man who therefore wanted to see constructive criticism of his work, and even particularly humorous criticism of his work. And then the judiciary. You know, this institution building had to be across the board. Parliament, the free press, the structures of the system. But the judiciary was very important. I mean, Mr. Nehru was occasionally a hot-tempered man. He would lose his temper. And in a press conference, he said something intemperate about a judge, a particular judgment the Congress party didn't like. Barely was the press conference over, then he regretted what he had done. He immediately dashed off a letter of apology to the judge in question. And then he wrote what can only be described as a groveling letter to the Chief Justice of India, apologizing for having insulted the judiciary. And he made those letters public. What is the purpose of doing this? Again, the same message. The institutions matter, not the individual. There's this unfair, ridiculous charge by some in the present ruling dispensation that he tried to groom his daughter as a successor. On the contrary, at no stage did he indicate a preference for any successor. And what is more, when she was a very highly effective president of the Congress party, as with other presidents at that time, he gave her the 1 year and that was it. She was replaced and that was it. It was her turn, she was on. He was very clear about all of these things. And I think when you look back on the extraordinary contribution he made to building up the kind of respect for democracy that we have now taken for granted. I think one of the absolute evidences for his success was that upon his death, when American journalist Wallace Hangen had even published a book saying, after Nehru, who? And the diplomatic corps was busy asking, after Nehru, what? When Nehruji died, the nation wept, but there were no political or constitutional convulsions. An acting prime minister was appointed, a Congress party then elected a new prime minister, the nation went on, and that's exactly what Nehruji would have wanted, because he was asked by an American editor, Norman Cousins, of the Saturday Evening Post, what do you want to be your legacy to India? And he said, 330 million people capable of governing themselves. That was an extraordinary line, which I found in this magazine and have used in the book, because although the numbers have grown, that really was, I think, his most significant legacy. Our democracy exists because of Jawaharlal Nehru shaping it, making it possible. During those 17 years, a number of post-colonial heroes in other ex-colonies had gone the opposite way. From Nkrumah to Kaunda to Nyerere, they started off as democratically popular heroes and headed in an authoritarian direction, saying that you needed authoritarianism in order to keep the country under control, to keep it together, to prevent divisions, and to direct development. Nehruji never fell into that trap. So if today we have a chaiwala as Prime Minister, it's because Nehruji made it possible to create the institutional structures through which any Indian can aspire to and rise to the highest office in the land. I'll be a little briefer on the other elements Mrs. Gandhi pointed out. Secularism is probably self-evident. This was a man without a prejudiced bone in his body. And it was quite remarkable that it's partly from his very upbringing. He had a Muslim munshi in the house whom he looked to with great deference and respect. His closest friends included, in fact, perhaps for some years, his absolutely closest friend, the man with whom he exchanged some remarkable letters and some very intimate, revealing personal letters, Syed Mahmud, was a Muslim. In fact, in one of those letters, he says he doesn't like his name. He says, Jawahar is bad enough, but the addition of Lal makes it odious. So, and this is something he confided into with his friend Syed Mahmud, and he was also not particularly religious. I think we have to accept the fact that the well springs of Nehruvian secularism did lie in agnosticism. It was not that he disrespected religion, but that he had no time for the professed leaders of it. He has letters, one of which I've quoted in the book, where he says, I have no patience for mullahs and maulvis and sadhus and sants. They don't have all the answers to the problems of the nation. And that is an interesting thing, because while that was very much his personal proclivity, he never imposed that on a nation which was obviously very deeply steeped in religion. And it's interesting, for example, the disagreement he had with President Rajendra Prasad about the president's wish to inaugurate the rebuilt Somnath temple. He said, the temple may be built, but you are the president of the country. As a symbol of the Indian state, you should not be the one going there. President Prasad insisted. He went, and Nehruji bit his tongue. But the fact still is, it was more the idea that the state must be above communal biases, and what is more, that the state must keep a distance from activities identified with any one religious community. Now, we know the country has evolved differently from his time, but he chose to maintain an attitude of equal respect for and equal distance from all religions throughout his time in office. And one of the things that was striking about his 17 years is, of course, no one has ever seen him entering a religious place of worship of any denomination. But at the same time, no one has ever heard him say one disrespectful word or one negative comment about what he accepted were other people's precious beliefs. But what was very important was, again, context. What was the India of 1947? Torn apart by the desire of one particular community or its politically elected leaders for a different nation. Again, the temptation to say, all right, if Pakistan has been created as a country for Muslims, what remains is a country for Hindus? He never fell into that temptation. He never accepted the logic of partition, and the logic of partition having been rejected, that if you want to believe that religion is a determinant of nationhood, that is the idea of Pakistan. If you don't believe that religion is a determinant of nationhood, but that your nationalism embraces all, that is the idea of India. And it's on that spirit that Nehruji moved forward. And as you know, from what he has been able to build up, I remember all those slogans in my school days of national integration, both the symbolism and the substance of secularism in government policy, in government appointments, and the fact that there were powerful cabinet ministers, officials, army and air force and navy officers, ambassadors from every community. And indeed, the same for our diplomats, for our cricket captains. Nehruji always weighed in favor of the diversity of India. And that secularism as a recognition of diversity and pluralism was again a vital Nehruvian legacy. Socialism, Mrs. Gandhi has already put it very well, and you heard it in his speech. It came from an urgent and abiding concern for India's poor. He was always very much concerned about those who weren't born into the kinds of opportunities he'd had. He was the son of the wealthiest lawyer in Allahabad. Motilal Nehru was the first person in Allahabad, brown or white, to bring a motor car into the city, because he was the first one who could afford to do so. Nehruji knew he'd grown up in the lap of privilege and was therefore all the more conscious of the needs to address the absolute desperation of those who had so little. And right through his political career, you see this from his early 20s onwards. In fact, even in the UK as a student, there's a wonderful anecdote when he went, I think, once to a dance, a social dance, and he chose to dance with a waitress because he wanted to find out what the lower classes would talk about. He wasn't interested in one of the glamorous society ladies. To do this kind of curiosity and concern for the underprivileged, for those at the bottom of society, marked his socialism. And of course, that was the temper of the times. He was strongly influenced by many of the Fabian socialist thinkers in the UK, notably Harold Lasky, who became a friend. He was also, of course, somebody who had visited the Soviet Union in the 1920s with his father, and was quite impressed by what he saw. And he saw in many ways, as many intellectuals of that period did, an answer to the problems of poverty and of underdevelopment in the socialist way. And don't forget, it's also a reaction to imperialism. Colonial exploitation and loot of India was being done by those who had ostensibly come to do good but preferred to do well. And these people were essentially draining India's resources for the benefit of their mother country. And naturally, part of the rejection of imperialism involved a rejection of international capital and, by extension, to some degree, of Indian capitalism. As Mrs. Gandhi said, that's evolved a lot. The Congress Party itself was in the forefront of the liberalization of 1991. But what has never left the party, and that's again is an essential component of the Nehruvian legacy, is the respect for social justice. Because socialism, once you take about the ism, and Mrs. Gandhi, Indira Gandhi famously said, I don't believe in isms, I believe in people. The truth is that isms apart, what remains is this abiding concern for social justice. And Mrs. Gandhi mentioned briefly, and I think the introduction mentioned the many policies followed by the Congress Party as part of UPA 1 and 2, which have tried to deepen the social justice legacy of Jawaharlal Nehru in our contemporary politics. Finally, on foreign policy and non-alignment, I'd say very simply that non-alignment was a response to a particular period, the binary politics of the Cold War, but at the same time, it was something that allowed India to stand with self-respect on the world stage. There's an apocryphal story that I think I do quote in the book about John Foster Dulles, President Eisenhower's Secretary of State, who had famously or notoriously said that non-alignment, neutrality between good and evil is itself evil, he said. And the story goes that he asked Nehruji in a question that has become more familiar to us on the lips of a more recent American figure. He allegedly said, "Are you with us or against us?" And Nehruji smiled and replied, "Yes." So we are with you when we agree with you, we are against you when we disagree. And that, I think, sums it up. It has been called by scholars an emphasis on strategic autonomy. But strategic autonomy basically means for 200 years, a foreign country has been taking decisions for us. We will now take our own decisions. It may sometimes be in your favor, it may sometimes be against you, but we will decide. You won't decide for us. And in a world of alliances being created, NATO, CETO, CENTO, all of that, India was invited to join CETO. And India declined, saying that we don't see the need for these things. We would rather, not having won our freedom and our autonomy, we'd rather not mortgage it right now to another alliance. We'll make our own decisions. And I think that must be understood. He was also, of course, in many ways, the originator of Indian foreign policy, going right back to the nationalist movement, when he was Gandhiji's preferred delegate to a number of international conferences, international socialist conferences, anti-colonial conferences. He was always the articulator of India's place in the world and the drafter of Indian National Congress's resolutions on foreign policy. And so when he came to office, it was natural that he would continue expressing this independent voice. Today you could argue we don't have two superpowers to be non-aligned between. But I think what you cannot argue against is that fundamental idea that our autonomy, our strategic decision making is about our self-respect. It is about not allowing anyone else to dictate to us what we can or should not do or say. And we will decide. We may choose not to say something, we may choose to say something. We may choose to do something, we may choose not to do it. But it'll be because we, sovereign, independent Indians, have made that decision. Now that is the legacy in many ways. And we've seen, sadly, a concerted campaign of vilification, a concerted campaign of calumny, an astonishing amount of lies that are out there on the internet. All of you, I'm sure, if you are on WhatsApp, will have received God knows how many offensive messages. And why is there this desire to undermine such a great son of India, somebody who laid the foundations for what we have created? You don't like socialism, fine, but you're not going to disavow the institutions that he created, as we said in the promo. That entire underpinning of India's scientific establishment. If today the government can boast about Mangalyaan, ask who created ISRO, who decided that even poor India could dare to aim for the skies, who created the IITs that send so many bright young men to Silicon Valley so that 40% of the startups there are helmed by Indians, who became the only prime minister in the world to attend these countries' the National Science Congress every year, and to speak there and to give respect and support to scientists. All of this in a poor country was optional. You had to have the vision to say we need to do all these things. We need to lay the foundations to build the India of the future. You know, in many ways, this is taken for granted by our people. We decry the fact that we still have poverty in our country. We don't realize that when Nehru ji came to power in 1947, 90% of the Indian population lived below the poverty line. We talk about the rate of growth under Mr. Nehru with a certain amount of disparagement. But the rate of growth from 1900 to 1947 was below 0.01%. We talk about the fact that we still have malnourishment, hunger, etc. We forget the fact that in 1947, the life expectancy of the average Indian was 27. People born in India could not expect to live beyond 27. Today, it's nearer the biblical 70. We talk about how so many Indians still remained illiterate, but we don't know, or we don't remember that the British left us with 16% literacy, and that of Indian women, it was 8.8%. Of every 12 Indian women, only one was literate. 12 and a half Indian women, actually. So that was the kind of legacy from which he was building up the state. When you realize what India was in 1947, when you realize the poverty, the horror, the loot, the suffering that had been inflicted upon the nation for 200 years, you then begin to understand how much was achieved in these 17 years. That instead of going into a tin pot, third world dictatorship, quote unquote, the cliched phrases of so many Western journalists or so many countries in the developing world, that India became a shining beacon by its own example, a democracy that worked, a society that actually strived to pull up the people at the bottom of the ladder, a country in which the most astonishing diversity was managed together in order to create one people and one nation, a country which stood proud and independent and spoke its own voice in the world, so that as late as the first decade of the 21st century, an Egyptian ambassador to the UN, who later went on to become his country's foreign minister, was able to say to me, you know, when I don't know about an issue that's unexpectedly come up, I send my diplomats to the Indians to find out what they're saying, because if they're saying it, it'll be all right. My country can say it too. That is the respect that India enjoys because of the foundation, the pillars that Nehruji laid for us. Let us today remember that man. I want to thank Penguin and my good friend Ranjana Sengupta for having brought a handsome new edition of this book before all of you.
I must say that it's a vast improvement on the original. So even those of you who have, I don't mean in terms of the content is the same, despite a new introduction that I have written, but the presentation, the printing, the layout is much more handsome than the original edition that came out in 2003. So even if you have a copy of that one, get one of this, it's really worth it. And I want to thank all of you, and once again, Mrs. Gandhi. In fact, I was just thinking, Dr. Karan Singh, that the last time we talked about Nehruji's letters was when Dr. Karan Singh published a compilation of letters of his and Nehruji's across the years. I believe I had the great pleasure of reading some of these letters aloud to the audience. So it's a matter of great satisfaction today to see Mrs. Gandhi here, Dr. Karan Singh here, and all of you good friends. Thank you again, Penguin. Jai Hind.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Shashi Tharoor. Absolutely captivating. You amaze us every single time with such a delightful oration, and your profound knowledge in history and his vision for future was amazing to see. Absolutely brilliant. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give it up for Dr. Shashi Tharoor. Once again, let's hear a big round of applause, everyone. Well, thank you so much, sir. We would like to once again thank Honorable Mrs. Sonia Gandhi for being with us over here in this evening. Thank you so much for gracing the occasion, ma'am. We are going to, in a little while, I guess Dr. Tharoor will be signing the books, and following which we will go towards a very sumptuous dinner. But before that, I would like to mention a gentleman because of whom we are here. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a huge round of applause to Mr. Anand Kamal, a man of sheer passion.
Anand, you're the most conspicuous omission for my thanks. My apologies. You made this evening possible. Thank you.
Yes, so we are going to go. You can have questions. If you have questions, please, if you could raise your hands, we could come up with a mic to you. And sir, we were just talking about Nehruji having, so much of youth following. And yesterday, I just happened to mention someone that I'm doing a show with Dr. Shashi Tharoor, and the lady was like, "Oh, really? Dr. Tharoor?" I'm like, "Okay." And she's like, please tell him that Meenakshi has said a hi. So she assumed that you know Meenakshi, sir. So she says a hi, and you really have a huge youth following. That is very true. Yes, the youth icon of India. Ladies and gentlemen, any questions? If you could please raise your hands, we could reach you. We have the mics ready, do we? I can come to you. That's not a problem. Yes.
It's not compulsory, but if anyone wants to ask or comment, I'm happy to respond.
Well, thank you, Dr. Tharoor. It was a very moving speech you gave. My name is Jay Krishnan from Indiana University. One question I have is, in this current political climate, especially as you were talking about these foreign policy initiatives, how would someone like Mr. Nehru address a political figure like Donald Trump in today's context?
Honestly, I don't think they would have got along. Because unfortunately, I think Mr. Trump incarnates many of the very qualities that Nehruji would not have respected. That is intolerance, intemperate language, rudeness and disrespect for people, whether minorities, women, many other groups he doesn't like, and a certain belligerence of tone and language that would have made Mr. Nehru bristle. I mean, he was a highly educated, civilized, cultured individual who, even when he disagreed with people, did so by and large in the kind of language appropriate to the seriousness of the discussion. He was not somebody who I think would have had much patience for Mr. Trump's beliefs or his manner of expressing them. धन्यवाद.
क्या बात है.
उसकी बात करते हैं रेस्पेक्ट की. You might be knowing that Pandit ji, Deputy President Menon, first Suez Canal crisis talks, and Mr. Eisenhower came to know that Mr. Nehru is not coming. He said, "What shall I do if Mr. Nehru is not coming?" I can go very
Wonderful, sir.
And sir, I confess to you, not even a single day there when I could not come to take candidate. I attended his funeral, I listened to him as a child, and one of his speeches on 15th August he started. I think कल आपने जन्माष्टमी मनाई है, आज 15 अगस्त, दो बड़ी स्पीच और 57 के अंदर या 58 में बच्चे मेरी तरह से वो ग्रेट फादर बन गया होंगे एंड आई वाज नॉट वन ऑफ दोस चाइल्ड बच्चे एंड पूछा बच्चों मेरे जाने के बाद हिंदुस्तान का काम कैसे करोगे? पंडित जी ऐसे आप करते हैं वो उनके रेडियो दोबारा दिखा रहे उस टेप को, उनको गुस्सा आता है बहुत जोर से, गलत, बिल्कुल गलत, तो आज इनकी पैदाइश हो, बहुत अच्छा करोगे।
बहुत बहुत
उनके लिए प्रमोशन बच चुका है, ये बताने के लिए हम कैसे सर्वाइव करें अगर हम मंडी की ट्रेनिंग में था।
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for wonderful sharing, sir. Thank you.
Good evening, Dr.
Good evening.
From Public Diplomacy Forum. What I wanted to know is that in the past month, you released two books. One on the current Prime Minister, one on the first Prime Minister. So is your new next book gonna be about the Prime Minister of 2019?
I think that is going to be a book written by the voters of India. So I will leave it to them to decide who should occupy that chair. But I certainly expect and believe there will be a change. So there will have to be a different book.
Congratulations, Shashi, for this once again another remarkable book.
Thank you.
One of the things which there's a narrative that has been established not just now, but I think for a while, for among many people, is that Nehru's possible obsession to become the Prime Minister, and in that sense, a narrative regarding partition. So in a way, and among all the sort of campaign that is being launched, vilifying his position, it will be useful for you to talk a bit about that aspect of his legacy, which is also clearly a sort of a contemporary, fake news framework that has been.
Very true. I'm glad you mentioned it. My book does deal with this. Certainly in the pre-independence era, there's absolutely no doubt that it was Mahatma Gandhi who made the choice. Mahatma Gandhi was a giant in the nation. Even when he was no longer formally a member of the Congress, he dictated many of its policies, influenced the election of its presidents. His was the voice that mattered. And there is no doubt that he had early on decided that despite the fact that he and Nehruji had significant differences with each other on many issues, that nonetheless this was the man with the vision, the heart, the passion, the energy to actually lead India. And in fact, you will know that when in the last year before independence, there was the question of electing a new president of the Congress to replace Maulana Azad, who had been president during 40 to 46 in the war years. And Maulana Azad had served 6 years, mainly, of course, in prison, and the time had come for a new leader. At that time, I think he's giving me some tea. At that time, the provincial chiefs of the Congress decided to opt for Sardar Patel because he was a strong man. He was capable of leading the organization very effectively. It was Mahatma Gandhi who said to Sardar Patel, "No, you step down, make way for Jawaharlal. Independence is coming soon and he's the right man to lead us." And Sardar Patel himself, thank you so much, volunteered to do that because he recognized the wisdom of Gandhiji's approach. After Nehruji became Prime Minister, there are many, many examples of his not wishing to cling to power. I'll give you one general proposition, is that whenever he raised an issue that members of the cabinet disagreed with, his instinctive reaction was to offer his resignation. It was never to try and push his way through, blast the others and so on. He said, no, if you disagree and enough of you disagree, find someone else to lead you. I'm quite happy to step aside. It was another matter that the moment he offered to resign, they all came rushing back and said, no, please stay. But the fact is that that was not the instinct of a dictator, it was the instinct of a democrat. The second example, and this is often forgotten, is that he actually did resign in 1957. At the end of 10 years after independence, he said he'd had enough. He had planned a 6-month trekking holiday in his beloved Kashmir. to go off. And he had said, I'm quitting and I'm leaving, and you elect your own successor. The Congress party tried to talk him out of it. He refused. There was then an international outcry that Nehru had resigned. And there were letters and telegrams from both Khrushchev and Eisenhower. Both the Soviet Union and the US said the world cannot do without you. And armed with all of this, the Congress party came back and said, we cannot afford to let you go. You absolutely have to continue. So very reluctantly, he cut down the 6-month holiday to a 2-week holiday, went climbing in the mountains for 2 weeks, and then came back and resumed. But he was really, that last 7 years of his prime ministership, he would have been quite happy to forgo. This was not a man who was either obsessed with becoming prime minister or obsessed with staying prime minister. A true Democrat. Sorry, who has the mic? I beg your pardon? Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Deeksha Bhardwaj. All I really wanted to ask is, since you talked about how Nehru practiced a very civilized form of political discourse, and that was a very reverential aspect to how he spoke about whether people who were senior to him in terms of protocol or any political opponents for that matter. Where do we locate India's political discourse right now? I mean, there is belligerence on part of all political parties. I mean, no one has been left to blame. Even Rahul Gandhi, for that matter, has been dragged down because they
I would say that our discourse it's so much in the trough that it would be unrecognizable to people of Nehru's generation. People just didn't talk like that. They often had more courage in expressing criticism of their own leaders as well as that of the other side. They had more courage to stand up. As I said, the example of Mahadev Tyagi and his telling his own prime minister, I have no hair on my head, will you give my head away to the Chinese? That kind of talk is inconceivable today. Can you imagine a BJP MP speaking like that, Narendra Modi? It'll be his head that will be off the next day. So you have to understand that the climate was not of lack of courage, but it was at least, there were sort of civilized norms within which these things could be said and dealt with. And one of the most remarkably striking things about all of this is that today the discourse is cheapened to such a level that things which would not even have been considered polite to express in the privacy of your own living room are now being said on public platforms in our country. Well, I think somebody had a hand up at the back there.
Good question.
Yep.
With so much history, and sorry, it's me, I know history.
Yeah, I am.
With the benefit of hindsight, looking back so many years, do you think we could have done something differently, and Nehru could have done something differently to keep India and Pakistan together?
It's a tough one because, I mean, partition was not an idea that anyone saw as inevitable or anything until 46. The Pakistan resolution was passed at a time when the Congress provincial governments had all resigned. They were not in office to take advantage of any governmental position to resist it. And I'll be very honest and say that particularly with the Quit India movement, when the entire Congress leadership and organization went behind bars, the Congress essentially took itself out of the endgame of the nationalist movement. It was, I know it's not appropriate to say so in front of so many veteran congressmen, but one can debate whether it was the wisest thing to have done, at least with hindsight, because what happened was the British promptly took advantage of the fact that the Congress was totally up. They had won 7 of the 9 provinces. The other 2 provinces had been won by secular parties. Punjab had been won by the Unionist Party, which was a party of essentially big landowners and big peasants. And Bengal had been won by the Krishak Praja Party, which was Fazlul Haq's, again, mixture of Hindus and Muslims. Both states, the biggest states in terms of Muslim population, were actually being run by secular parties. The Muslim League had come a very distant, rather poor third in the national political stakes. So no one would have thought that partition was even a remotely feasible prospect. But the British took advantage of the absence of the Congress at that point to offer a number of advantages to the Muslim League. They appointed the Muslim League to governments that they had not been elected to. They appointed them to a number of positions that involved the ability to distribute patronage and pelf. And the League's membership, for example, went from 20 lakh in 1939 to 2 crore or 20 million in 1945. That was how much they were able to organize themselves, strengthen their appeal, reach out, enhance their membership. So the League, which had done badly in every electoral contest up to then, was absolutely ready and primed for the first elections after the war, whereas the Congress and all its leaders, workers, the organizational strength were locked up in jail. And when they came out blinking into the sunlight at the end of the war, they were completely unprepared for the strength the Muslim League had gained. On top of that, fate or destiny, whatever you want to call it, also intervened. The big leaders of the Unionist Party died. There were some very, very prominent and brilliant charismatic figures like Sir Sikandar Khan Tiwana and so on. They passed away. There was really no longer an effective secular Muslim leadership in Punjab to challenge the Muslim League. And in Bengal as well, Fazl Haq was at his last legs, and in the elections of 46, the Muslim League won Bengal. So both Bengal and Punjab, the two most populous provinces in terms of Muslim population, actually voted for the League in the elections of 1946. The only significant Muslim majority province that stayed with the Congress was the Northwest Frontier province, where Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan and his Gandhianism still had a great appeal. His brother Dr. Khan Sahib became chief minister in 46, but everywhere else the League had unquestionably earned the right to portray itself as the principal voice of Muslim opinion in India. In those circumstances, when the League was insisting on partition, it had to be taken seriously. Both the Congress and the British resisted it for a while. Then Jinnah's Direct Action Day, which was essentially a call to arms, was an absolute warning of things to come if partition was resisted, because unfortunately mobs ran loose on the streets. Thousands were killed. Particularly, it was called by the British the Great Calcutta Killing. And the British law enforcement authorities realized that the scale was beyond their capacity to control. They couldn't do anything about literally people being knifed in their homes, on the streets, in schools and colleges, etc. And the reports coming back to the British authorities was, we cannot hold this country in the middle of this. That's when the British decided to cut and run. And I think we have to understand that that hasty, ill-considered Brexit was actually partly an admission of their own exhaustion at the end of the war and their inability to supply the resources that would have been required to prevent large-scale communal violence. So partition, and this is the irony, was seen by Nehruji and the other leaders as the lesser evil, that without partition, you'd have more and more events like Direct Action Day with the Muslim League calling for violence, and that the result would be more killing. So it was seen as a way of avoiding bloodshed, that if you declare partition, at least they can go in peace and there will not be killings. There was also a constitutional argument to this, which is that the League had actually accepted the Cabinet Mission Plan of 1946, which was a plan that would have grouped India into 3 groups of provinces. One would have been Muslim majority provinces, one would have been Hindu majority provinces, and third would have been princely states. And after 10 years, any of these would have had the right to secede. Now, not only would this have given India a very weak center, because it would have basically been a country where the central government would only have controlled foreign affairs, defense, currency, and communications. Everything else would have been with these groups of provinces. But given the Pakistan resolution of the Muslim League and the Muslim League's avowed policy of separation, it was very clear to the Congress that 10 years down the road they would exercise their right to secede, and the country would then become completely unviable. For this reason, they rejected the Cabinet Mission Plan. And they thought that rather than having either a constitutionally unviable country or a country that might split apart into smithereens through violence, the best option would actually be partition. I don't think either Nehru or any of the Muslim League leaders, certainly not Jinnah and Liaquat Ali Khan, who are on record, anticipated or expected a fraction of the violence that actually broke out. It is said that they were in a state of shock about the large-scale killings, which started by March, April, and just got worse and worse and worse. And then when the Radcliffe Award came and people knew where the lines were drawn, the desperation to cross and be on the right side was an enormous challenge on both sides. And 1 million people is a conservative estimate possibly for the numbers who actually died. So I don't know that in that period of 45 to 47 that Nehruji could have done anything different. I know there is a theory which Maulana Azad also of, that if Nehruji had not rejected the cabinet mission plan, he gave a statement in a press conference in Bombay in 46 where he said that the Congress reserves the right to examine its options, that is what triggered off the drive for partition. But I think honestly it's a very far-fetched criticism, because one remark in a press conference against all these historical forces and trends and developments I've described to you, I think make it very unlikely. I would say that partition owed much more to Jinnah's will than Nehru's willfulness, if you like, in saying what he said in the press conference. It certainly made life easier for the Brits because they could leave that much quicker and shed themselves of their responsibilities. So all of that contributed. I would argue, therefore, partition was not inevitable till 1945, 46, but in the last 12 to 18 months, the headlong rush was impossible for any person of goodwill to prevent.
Sorry, just a quick follow on there, because I raised the question because Wavell had suggested something somewhere in mid 1946, and that's what I was trying to gun at, not 1947. By 47, I think you're absolutely right. It was inevitable and impossible to stop.
No, but don't forget, in 46 they did form the interim government on it, and then the interim government actually was one in which the League and the Congress agreed. In fact, initially there was a big stumbling block. The Muslim League insisted that the only Muslims in the government would be the ones nominated by the League. And the Congress, as a secular party which had prominent Muslims in it, said no way. They can nominate their quota of ministers, but they can't tell us who we can and cannot nominate. But the Muslim League made it a deal breaker. And eventually people like Maulana Azad, Rafi Ahmed Kidwai, etc. had to be left out in order to create an interim government that the Muslim League would be willing to participate in. Now the irony was the Muslim League used its participation in the interim government to show that partition was unavoidable. They actually obstructed every single initiative and decision of the government. Liaquat Ali Khan ran the finance ministry and he refused to approve anything that the non-Muslim League ministers proposed to him. So Patel, there's a famous letter of Patel's complaining that he was not allowed to hire a chaprasi because the finance minister said we won't pay his salary. That was the kind of obstructionism that came during the disastrously abortive experiment of the interim government. So again, it's difficult. Wavell had this idea, we'll get them to work together, and eventually actually working together and running the country will make them come together. There's also the Lapierre-Collins theory that if people had held on a bit longer, Jinnah would have died, because as you know, he had TB and only his doctor knew. But the irony was that that partition was preponed, as it were, from the scheduled date of June 48 to August 47 by Mountbatten and by the British. And as a result, in any case, Jinnah was very much alive and well, or at least visibly was alive and well, when partition eventually did happen. I don't know, ifs and buts we all share, and I know many of my Punjabi friends like you have these very strong and passionate regrets about what happened, and I think many of us do feel that regret, but we now have to move on. I mean, after all, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, in his famous speech at the Minar-e-Pakistan, said that Pakistan doesn't exist because India wished it to. We wish you well. It's a different country now. Now 71 years have gone by, and I think the conversation at some point becomes purely an exercise in futility.
Hi, Tashlika Shankar. Thank you for the invitation. It's great to be at a Delhi event after a long time, since I now live in Bangkok. Two simple questions, not as deep as him, was, since you've done a book on the first Prime Minister, the Invention of India, would you say that the last book you wrote would be the reinvention of India by the latest? And the second question is with the importance of social media now, I mean, you use it well, and there are many people who use it badly. Trump, for instance. This web series, could we have some information? Because I think it's a very good, very important step in this day of social media.
Thank you. Well, if we'll give the mic to the gentleman sitting right in front of you, he can answer on the web
Well,
series.
I want an answer to the first question.
The first question is about the reinvention of India is I hope not. And the reason I say I hope not is because very frankly, the project of reinvention is precisely what we're trying to stop. We believe that the essence of India is that which is enshrined in the Constitution of India. And that does incorporate these Nehruvian values I talked about. And that essence of India, to my mind, should never be forgotten. It's extremely important, it seems to me, that if we don't prevent that reinvention of India, we will end up with a country that is not the India that Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru and Maulana Azad fought to free. It'll be something else. Nehruji famously said in a phrase that I have been pilloried for, that we don't want our country to be a Hindu Pakistan. And that's essentially the message, that Pakistan was a different idea, that people of a particular religion were entitled to a nation. India is a different idea. And if you now start borrowing the Pakistani idea and applying it in India, then you are indeed reinventing India, and many of us are determined not to allow that to happen. On the web series, Sheetal, would you like to say a word? I mean, Sheetal can give you the full details of how many episodes. It's going to be 3, 4, 6. So it'll be 6 parts. And as you can see, you heard my voice on the promo because I'll narrate it. But the footage is essentially archival footage. So they've dug up some terrific material. I must say, I love this promo and I want to see much more of this kind of footage, because many of us today have no real sense of what Nehruji looked like, how he behaved, how he moved, how he ran up the stairs, how he spoke, what he sounded like. And I think the great strength of the web series is it brings to life qualities that I've written about in the book, but which you can now also see visually and hear. And that's why I'm so excited about it. I think the target date for completion is very early next year. And we're hoping that people will have a chance to rediscover Jawaharlal Nehru. If he wrote The Discovery of India, I hope the web series will be the India's rediscovery of Nehru.
Right.
Last one perhaps, and then we should probably... Oh, sorry,
yes, we have a gentleman.
I didn't realize there were people listening here. Sorry.
Sorry. Hi, sir. Sir, my name is Rajat. Sir, my question, I think a lot of people out here would like to know. So with respect to the current government, we see there's a strong effort to drive a wedge between Nehru and Patel. It's been continuously there. So could you shed some light on what sort of a relationship, I must say, two lifelong Congress leaders actually shared?
No, it was an amazingly interesting relationship. There was a tremendous amount of mutual respect, and there were some real disagreements. And the point about the Congress party is that disagreements throughout that period never translated into a separation. In other words, people accepted and respected their differences, but they worked together for the common cause. And this was apparent throughout, and I've quoted bits of it in the book, so I hope you'll see some of the correspondence between them. The portrayal that there were sort of two rivals at loggerheads is simple nonsense. Patel often willingly and voluntarily made way for Nehru, particularly on 3 occasions for the presidency, but the presidency was always a one-year deal. So when Nehru stepped aside, Patel got his turn later, there's no problem there. Secondly, Patel disagreed with Nehru on socialism. Patel was actually from an agricultural farmer background as well as being a lawyer, and he was somebody who understood, if you like, the sort of popular sentiments of the of the rural peasant. But at the same time, he did have a lot of respect for industrialists. Don't forget, many of them financed the nationalist movement. It's not that you can run a nationalist movement like the Congress Party, make it a mass movement, without people who can afford to give you money to organize rallies and dharnas and demonstrations, God knows what else. It does take an effort. It needs support, needs contributions. And Patel respected the contributions that these people whom perhaps Nehru could afford to dismiss as fat cats. Nehru, you see, lived on his royalties. It's a very interesting thing that people don't realize. Nehru was not a practicing lawyer. He got a law degree, but he hardly ever practiced. Briefly at the beginning of his career, then he was a full-time politician. So what did he live on? he was living on the royalties of his books, particularly published abroad, some of which, like The Discovery of India or his own autobiography, actually made it to the American bestseller list. So the money that was coming in was enough for a comfortable life from the royalties, but he wasn't dependent on the charity of capitalists. So he could afford, if you like, a certain, what Patel would have considered a somewhat theoretical view of capitalism. Whereas Patel, working in the real world, knew that we needed all sections to get the party functioning. So that was definitely one area of disagreement. When the question of the prime ministership came up, Patel not only yielded to Nehru, but said in private and in public that Nehru was indeed the right man and he'd be happy to serve under him as deputy. They disagreed on a couple of things. They disagreed, for example, on Pakistan. And in particular, there was this perception that persecution of Hindus in East Pakistan was something that Patel kind of reacted very negatively to, arguing that in many ways an entire community has seceded and India should be the protector of the rights of the other community, namely the Hindu community. Whereas Nehru never accepted that logic, and they disagreed quite ferociously on some occasions about this. But nonetheless, these differences were thrashed out amongst themselves. When the Chinese marched into Tibet, and Nehru, on the advice of our ambassador in Beijing, Sardar Panikkar, accepted that India would not only recognize the Chinese takeover of Tibet, but that we would withdraw our troops who were stationed in Lhasa and 3 and 4 other outposts. Patel disagreed very strongly and wrote a famous letter, which is still arrived. It's one of the last letters he wrote on China policy, which is often held as an example. But had Patel lived, they would have talked to each other, discussed it in cabinet, discussed it one-on-one, come to modus vivendi. It must not be assumed that the expression of disagreement meant there was hostility. That's something that in today's climate people don't understand. The kind of respect I told you that Nehru showed to his critics, that is absent in today's political discourse. But in those days it was present within parties and between political opponents. So I would say that all the examples that can be cited can be countermanded by many more examples of their cooperation. It's a lovely letter from Sardar Patel where he says to Nehru, "In our combination lies our greatest strength." And that is precisely the message, because he was somebody who was in many ways complementing Nehruji. Nehruji had this charisma, this glamour, this vision, this eloquence, this mass appeal. Patel was doughty, somewhat dull, somewhat stern of face, but that too complemented Nehru. Patel was the organization man. He knew how to organize the party. He knew how to organize the government. He knew how to administer. Nehru was the visionary, came up with the ideas, the schemes, the sort of the glorified dreams for the nation that he was able to articulate. But those dreams, to be brought down to earth and implemented, Patel was the man. Again, the combination was their great strength. And it's India's great misfortune that Patel didn't live long enough, or that Patel wasn't 10 years younger and could have really assisted this process for longer. But it is important to recognize that they were a combination, they were allies, and their disagreements were disagreements couched with respect and articulated within the context of a shared goal. Never at any stage would either of them have broken away from the other or formed a different party or anything like that. Both were committed to the memory and the values of Mahatma Gandhi. And even on this issue of the Liaquat Pact that Nehru signed, that Patel initially opposed, in the end, Patel surrendered to Nehru. Why? On the Gandhian argument that the counter atrocities by Hindus on Muslims in West Bengal removed the moral justification for his position about Muslim atrocities on Hindus in East Bengal. So he said, as a Gandhian, that I can no longer say that that is wrong when we are doing wrong things in our country, and therefore I accept the Nehru position. It's a kind of moral thinking that we seem to be incapable of in our politics today. But people thought and acted and believed in that spirit in those days. Yes.
Badri Raina.
Badri Raina. How
Yes,
are you, sir?
I'm fine. Thank you very much. I'm glad of this evening, first of all, and I'm very happy I was there. Absolutely exhilarating, acute exegesis of extremely complicated and difficult spectrums of history, and trusting, I think, to your inexhaustible intellectual energy. I have a meta-historical poser. as much to yourself as to me myself.
Then it'll have to be the last question.
You see, when I look at the history of the world up to the French Revolution, barring perhaps Buddhist thought, the universal trope accepted almost everywhere in the world is that human beings are unequal, and that is the order of nature. That's the way it should be. And I think that you probably agree that what the French Revolution did, especially the philosophers, was to bring us home to the idea of the possibility of equality. I'm thinking of Condorcet and Diderot and Montesquieu and Rousseau and a whole lot of people, people whom Marx called his teachers. In other words, there is one paradigm of democracy which is positivist, that from hunting-gathering there is a dynamism which is in a sense irreversible, and time and space move from irrationality to greater rationality, from injustice to justice, and it'll carry on. Now, does it seem to you that we are now in a phase where that watershed moment of the French Revolution? I mean, Marx, for example, said to these people that I want precisely what you were saying you want, equality, fraternity, liberty, but I want it for everybody. And your economic thinking doesn't make it possible for this to be made available to everybody. And therefore, I want to carry on from here. But be that as it may, does it seem to you that with the incredible centralization of capital the world over, there has been now incrementally a tremendous need for the centralization of political power? And that probably is one reason why you find country after country after country. I mean, for example, 1% Indians own 73% of our national wealth. And this is pretty much the same in America. And of course, we call them democracies. We call them democracies. Now, does it seem to you that with this centralization, economic and political both, there is now, meta-historically, a reversal from the French Revolution back into a trope where we seem to be selling the idea that people are unequal and should be unequal, whether it's color of skin or gender or caste or ethnicity or economic power or all kinds of things. In other words, there is a whole movement towards atavistic nativisms grabbing us all over the world. And if that is so, how do we possibly propose to reverse this?
Thank you, Professor, and as usual, very thoughtful and broad vision of the global challenge. Of course, it goes well beyond the scope of this book. But I would agree with you that there has been definitely a reversal. It's not new. I think you can trace it back to about 1980 when two phenomena happened. The election of Ronald Reagan in America, which first articulated the philosophy that was later summarized in that decade under the words greed is good, and the onset of globalization, which also can be traced back to roughly to 1980. And I would say that this reversal today, because the initial period, I would argue, globalization was very benign, because in fact, it actually helped the poor and the underclass in the developing countries, particularly China, but also other developing countries. And it helped the lower middle class and the consumers in the developed countries. But within a generation, other problems began. And in the developed countries, the working class realized they were losing out because their jobs were being exported to Shanghai. So you had a working class resentment of globalization. And the onset of a sort of cosmopolitan globalism, the birth of Davos man, the idea that the blurring of financial boundaries also meant the blurring of national boundaries. Migration was picking up. More than 5% of the world's population now lives in countries other than in those in which they were born. All of these changes and transformations began to occur. That created a cultural backlash to go along with the economic backlash of the developed countries. And the cultural backlash was against people who are not like us, different color, different religion, different habits, different ways of dressing, different ways of eating, different ways of speaking. And I think what you're seeing in recent years now is the merger of these two backlashes. Certainly the person of Trump involves both of those, the economic backlash as well as the cultural. When the Trumpists talk about guns, God, and gays, it's a way of reasserting a certain vision of what America was in the fantasy good old days. And when he says make America great again, he's really saying make America white again, which in fact can't happen, because by 2030, the tyranny of demography will ensure that a majority of the American working force will be non-white. But this is the cusp of that entire period. Will it result in a long-term definitive victory for these forces of reaction or regression? Impossible to say, but I would argue not likely, because the sort of warriors of this point of view have themselves provoked a reaction. I think the intense feelings about Mr. Trump in America, there was a poll released today, according to the Washington Post, which shows that any Democratic candidate you can name, Biden, Hillary, Michelle Obama even, would defeat Trump in the next election. It's a long way away, but I'm just saying these are the kinds of reactions that you're getting to that. Brexit was very much a reflection of the rejection of migration from Eastern Europe, as well as, of course, of economic wrongs, imaginary for the most part. Today, there is a rethink. If there were a second Brexit referendum, Brexit would certainly lose, and lose big. You saw the rise of people in France, Marine Le Pen, Netherlands, Geert Wilders, Austria, and many other countries who still ended up only in second place. There were enough to stop them from the majority of the political class. There are some who've succeeded. Turkey's Erdogan is very much, when one forgets that even if he is not from the developed world, and he doesn't want to participate in the economic backlash, because like Modi, he wants to be Davos man, he doesn't want to stop Davos man. But internally, he believes very much that he represents a rooted authenticity, anchored in Islam and not in secular cosmopolitanism. And those are very much the same ideas that Mr. Modi's BJP wants to promote here, that they're anchored in Hinduism and not in the rootless secularism of the Nehruvians. So these are the kinds of phenomena you're seeing in many countries around the world. They could add up to the phenomenon you have so succinctly summarized. Whether that is going to be so enduring that 10, 15, 20 years from now, we will see this as a turning point in history that led us to perhaps a century or more of that kind of feeling, or whether it'll turn out to be a hiccup in a journey towards more eradication of boundaries between us and amongst us, that is, between countries and within countries, and a great leveling, that will depend very much on the choice of electorates and publics in many countries in the years to come. I'm an inveterate optimist, so I hope that your fears are not borne out for too long. Thank you all very much. It's been a terrific evening. I think I'll be signing books, right?